I'd like to welcome everyone to Chesslecture.com. My name is International Master Bill Paschall. It's my pleasure today to bring you the second edition of my lecture series entitled A Complete System Against the English Defense for Black. This is part 2 of my lecture series. So here we go, C4 for white. Get that move right out of the way. If you saw part 1 of my lecture series, you know that the topic concerned is C4, E5. C4, E5, I think a great principled move because it's the most aggressive move black can play, occupying the center directly. Fundamental, classical style. Now, I want to go over one little thing that I didn't talk about, and I will review again in our treatment of side variation, but possibility white can vary the move order here with G3. And I just want to say this, white plays G3 instead of knight to C3. Basically, don't really pay close attention to this. It's not a big deal. After G3, we're going to play knight C6 anyway. After bishop G2, F5 anyway. And knight to C3, we're going to end up in the same kind of position we normally end up in. So it's basically the same thing, as if white played knight to C3 on the second move. I will mention the fact that this move order, if you face it, gives black additional options. So in passing, I want to comment on the fact that you might want to think about other variations for black. G3, I think, is an interesting move, but it gives black other possibilities like knight F6 and C6, another system black can try, for example. So G3, although it seems like a tricky move order for white, also gives black additional possibilities. Anyway, knight C3, the primary move in the English opening. We're playing as if it's a closed Sicilian for black. Knight to C6, G3. So this is where we left off in the last lecture. After G3, F5, we're playing in Grand Prix attack style. Bishop to G2, knight to F6 naturally. And here, last lecture we talked about E3 in part 1 of the series. But today I'm going to talk about going a little further. After knight S6, I believe D3 deserves serious consideration, not allowing the gambit options we saw in part 1 of the series. D3, a lot of players are going to go for this, and it gives black basically 3 solid choices. I'm not going to recommend G6. I believe it's a good, solid move. It leads to just labyrinths of variations if you play G6. It takes an immense amount of preparation and tons and tons of games and variations, and it's very complex. G6 in King's Indian style is going to another position, another variation that's sort of outside the scope of the Grand Prix attack. So I recommend something else. In passing, I want to mention bishop C5 as a possibility. Bishop C5 as played in the famous game Sadie Fisher from the 1969 U.S. Championship, where Fisher won with an interesting gambit involving an early F4. My opinion about that gambit is that it's overrated. It may be playable for black, but I think it's not a secret. It's not even that effective. It's overrated. I recommend you play bishop to B4. Now, bishop to B4, you know, it's a good move. You're pinning the knight. You're developing quickly, preparing the castle. And also played in the Grand Prix attack where typical positions with colors reversed. Bishop B5. Similar positions. White is up a tempo here. But the threat of double pawns, I believe, is a very serious positional threat. We're going to take a look at a couple of different continuations. Because white has some options here. I've encountered different moves. But basically, there's 2 ways the game can develop. 1, white ignores the threat to double the pawns, and 2, white meets the threat to double the pawns. So we're going to go over those 2 different cases. And rather than deep variations, I want to go over the ideas. And with some example games, bishop to B4, I've played myself successfully. I've noticed that some players have annotated this, exaggerating it to the point where it's even a mistake for black. It is not a mistake for black. Statistics will not lie. Bishop to b4 has a good record statistically, and under no circumstances is this any kind of mistake, as earlier analysts might have annotated this with a dubious mark. I would never, ever believe that. Bishop to b4, probably the most common move is bishop to d2, meeting the pin. So what do we do after bishop d2? I have some interesting example games. So after bishop d2, castles is clearly the right move developing. Now white has some options. Break the pin right away with a3 or continue with development. That's the main question. If we use one of my own games, I like to be able to say I play this myself, because I'm not just recommending something random that I don't believe in. You know, when I recommend a lecture series here, I'm teaching you something that I have some fundamental belief in. So I'm using one of my own games as an example, Deering Paschall, and I believe that this game was played in 2004 in Budapest. A3 was played by International Master Eddie Deering. A3. Now, putting the question to the bishop, obviously I have to take, because retreating would be wasting time. Bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3. White has the bishop pair, but he's really expended a lot of time. Look at his kingside pieces. Rook on h1, knight on g1, king on e1. My kingside is developed. Potential pawn breaks and attacking ideas on the king side for black. White has the bishop pair. But as in a Nimzo, as in many lines of the Nimzo Indian, I think the development and attacking prospects that black has definitely compensate for the bishop pair. So if we take the Deering-Paschall game as an example, early a3 I don't think can be so critical. It's really kind of losing a tempo, forcing clarification of the position, but wasting a little bit of time. My game with Eddie Deering went d6, knight f3, and now I executed the classic attacking plan for black, queen e8. Queen e8, like in the Dutch defense, playing to transfer the queen to an active position on h5. f4 break with the idea of the bishop on c8, entering the game via g4, h3. Ideally, what black would like to do is get in queen h5 and bishop h3 to trade off white's valuable bishop, and also to trade off one of white's bishop pair, with good attacking prospects for black. I was able to execute a similar plan against Eddie Deering, but he was able to fend off my threats. It was an interesting game. Castles for white. And now my turn, black to play here. After castles, I made a risky decision. I mean, honestly, maybe queen h5 is the best move after castles, but I wanted to try to be aggressive, and I played f4 immediately. f4 immediately. He was brave and played a good move now, e3. Sometimes this is a tough move to make because it weakens certain squares, but I think Deering was correct to play e3, bring his queen into the game to try to pressure f4, maybe exchange pawns on f4 and open the e-file for himself. Also try to pry open the diagonal for the white bishop on c3. So again, in the game, Deering-Paschall, e3, queen h5, black threatens to attack on the king side. I played it like in the Sadie Fisher game, which is a different variation but similar idea, pawn sacrifice style. E takes f4, bishop g4, with a huge initiative for black. And at this point, he made a wise decision to give the pawn back. But he was worse after h3. I think a good decision, but forfeiting the initiative, a good practical decision. h3, bishop takes h3. And already black had at least equality, probably the better game. So you can see the rest of that game if you find it in a chess database somewhere. Deering-Paschall, but one example of a solid player with white after a mere 13 moves, admitting that he has no advantage at all and actually being forced on the defensive. So an example from my own games. a3, I think, a little bit too slow to pose serious problems for black. Going back to the position on move 6. So after 6 moves, I think we've got to try to find an improvement. So we can look to, for example, Mr. Hikaru Nakamura played an interesting example game, also completely unsuccessfully. If we look at the game from the 2005 World Open, young chess star Hikaru Nakamura playing white against Grandmaster Ildar Ibragimov. Nakamura trying to be fancy here and playing knight h3. Knight h3, an interesting kind of experimental plan with ideas of an early f4. So this is a good alternative to Eddie Deering's a3. In Nakamura Ibragimov developed sensibly. d6, good move. Now f4. This is kind of the plan. It looks weird, but to justify having the knight on h3 at such an early stage, white really needs to play this f4 move and give his knight the f2 square in some positions to retreat to. But very risky at this stage because white is not even castled yet. So I think Hikaru's plan is interesting, but basically even bordering on dubious because he weakens so many squares in this position. After f4, black played knight to g4, a very good move. f4, knight to g4. Immediately, Grandmaster Ibragimov focusing on the weakening of f2 and e3. And sometimes I think the bishop could and should have come back to c5 to further exploit those weaknesses. I'll show you exactly what I mean. I have a real serious improvement on this game, Nakamura Ibragimov. After castles, naturally, Hikaru took the chance to castle now. I don't understand why Nakamura allowed this, but he's trying to play experimentally, get something interesting. I think basically Ibragimov would have had a very good game after the simple bishop c5 check, bringing the bishop to a very effective position on c5 with check, with tempo. I mean, there's no way that black is not at least equal in this position. His king is safer, his development is decent. Bishop c5 was just an interesting try. But Ibragimov played more in the style of the system, doubling the pawns on the c file. Bishop takes c3, also a good way to play. And against a tactical player like Nakamura, maybe this was a very good practical decision. After bishop takes c3, white couldn't take back on c3 because of the weakness of the e3 square. He would lose the exchange. So after bishop takes c3, b takes c3. There's no weakness on e3, but the white pawn structure once again has been forfeited. After this, Nakamura was never able to get anything active going. It's so easy to play these lines for black. Look, Ibragimov just using the classic plan that I used against Deering, queen e8. So queen e8, easy to play. That's what makes the system so great. F takes e5, and now knight on c takes e5, a really good move from Ibragimov, getting his knight to an active position on e5. White can't play d4 because the c4 pawn for white would be very weak. So I thought this was kind of a creative move. Rather than the automatic pawn takes c5, knight on c takes e5 from Grandmaster Ibragimov. Very good attacking prospects for black on the king side. Queen c2 from white, just developing. And notice this pawn structure. The e file is half open for black. If white doesn't get in e4, he's going to be backward for a long time along that file. And that's precisely what happened in the game Nakamura Ibragimov. Let's just go a few moves further down the line. After queen c2, queen h5, black starts to have serious attacking prospects. And this was a very important game in the World Open in Philadelphia 2005. Queen h5. Now Nakamura playing very hesitantly. Queen c2, and then now queen b3. Clearly he doesn't have a plan. Another indispensable move in the system, which Ibragimov has used several times, king h8. King h8. Ibragimov, a great positional player, relying on this system for black. If Ildar can play this, you should think about playing this system as well. I think it's a very solid recommendation with good attacking chances. Now, Hikaru weakens certain squares with d4, weakening e4. Black with pressure on the white king side, knight g6. Now the e4 square and potentially the e file will be backward for white. Great attacking chances for black on the king side. Once again, folks, I recommend you find this game. Grandmaster Ildar Ibragimov winning convincingly with great positional play. Nakamura Ibragimov, Philadelphia 2005. We don't have time to go over the entire game here, but I think this is a good illustration of another game where white was unable to really get anything, and actually black took the initiative in this line with bishop to b4. Now, for a slightly different take, we see Ibragimov's handling of a strong opponent who allows the doubled pawns. So this isn't my own game, but it's a player who I have respect for, and I think a good role model to model the system after. Bishop to b4, another game, Barcenia versus Ibragimov, 2002, Las Vegas. So the Filipino grandmaster playing white here, also no slouch. We'll see what happens. We go back to move 6. So in this game, Barcenia doesn't care about the doubled pawns, which is reasonable, actually. He just plays knight f3 straight away. Knight f3 straight away is very much like a Rossolimo Sicilian. But in the Rossolimo Sicilian variations, the pawn would be on f2 or f7. Here it's advanced to f5. This makes for a very good attacking prospect for black. So doubled pawns, closed position, pawn on f5 to help with the kingside attack. Another important game, Barcenia versus Ibragimov. Knight f3. Here's the way to play it. Don't wait for the tempo now. Bishop takes c3 check. I think a very good way to play the line. Just damage the pawn straight away. B takes c. So Barcenia now. B takes c, d6. Ibragimov completes the formation. This is always a good pawn formation. d6. White has the bishop pair. Black has more space with this advanced pawn duo at e5 and f5. Always kingside attacking prospects. Barcenia plays this well, though, and he obviously knows what he's doing. After d6, castles for white. Castles for black. And now it's very important that white plays this next move. Black is on the verge of threatening a huge kingside attack with something like along the lines of f4. Barcenia plays knight e1 with the idea of holding up black's attack with f4. And you could definitely consider the pawn sacrifice f4 for black, but it's a little bit, perhaps, I believe, overambitious. I just cannot wholeheartedly recommend f4. I think it just could be going too far. So here, I support the way Ibragimov played against Barcenia in their game from 2002. Ibragimov, again, very sensible play. Guess the move. Yes, that's right, folks. Queen e8, the beginning of the recipe. Queen e8 with the attacking prospects, always a good plan. Queen e8, now f4 from Barcenia, who holds up the f4 attacking prospects, and positionally a very good idea. This sort of deadens black's bishop on c8. Notice the positional idea, deadening the black bishop on c8. After this, it's not an easy game. But one thing that black doesn't want is the game to open, because white has a dangerous bishop pair. And I think the way that Grandmaster Ibragimov played this position makes a lot of sense. e4. After f4, e4, closing the game. And this is a very long game, ladies and gentlemen. This was extremely long battle in a Swiss tournament where Ildar played and played and played, and the position was maybe equal, or maybe Barcenia had some good chances to hold the position, but in the closed position, Grandmaster Ibragimov really used his knights and slowly outplayed his opponent. I mean, I guess this position is roughly equal. After knight c2 as played in the game, bishop d7, slowly black just developed his pieces. A couple key things here to point out. Knight to e3, a good move from Barcenia, putting pressure on the d5 square, a standard maneuver in the Rossolimo Sicilian. This improves the position of the knight. The question is about the white bishops. Ibragimov playing, and like you have to play in this variation, in the Nimzovich style, shutting down the bishops, keeping the position locked, trying to keep the white bishops at g2 and c1 really shut down and show that the knights are superior. This is the strategic idea of the system. So after this move, knight e3, I think a very sensible move from Grandmaster Ildar, knight e7, overprotecting f5, and making way to use possibly a few different aces up our sleeves. Bishop on d7. As in the French defense, which Grandmaster Ibragimov also plays, sometimes bishop a4, sort of freezing move. Bishop c6, a solid option overprotecting this e4 pawn. So this frees the bishop for movement. It also makes way for c5, the Nimzovichian blockading move. So let's just go a few more moves into this game to really get an idea for what Ibragimov's plan is. After knight e7, white plays bishop a3. A great idea to try to activate the bishop, but it's going to be a dead end. After bishop a3, b6. Solid prevention of c5. And now just watch what happens. Ibragimov just waiting. Now white starts to get desperate. d4. I think this could be a mistake, taking pressure off the center and shutting it down, Nimzovich style, c5. And there's no way in the world that I will believe that already black isn't better here. After d4, c5, another grandmaster gone wrong with white. Good system for black, 5 bishop b4, a solid way to meet the plan with 5 d3, and thus rounding out another variation of our complete system against the English opening. So to sum up what we've seen here in this system, several different approaches for white, but basically the same kind of approaches for black against all three. The only critical difference is that we see sometimes white allowing the doubled pawns, sometimes white preventing the doubled pawns, and in the game Nakamura against Ibragimov, the doubled pawns happening anyway, even though Nakamura prevented them at first. Doubled pawns here in the final example, very weak for white. The same plans recurring again and again for black. Kingside themes, queen e8 to h5, closing the position against the bishops. Very systematic and easy to learn play in the Nimzovich style for black. I think you're going to enjoy playing this system for black. This is International Master Bill Paschall signing off from our Chesslecture.com series on a complete system for black against the English.